They called it an enforcement action, but if you look closely, frame by frame, you'll see it wasn't that. You'll see the truth. 5:47 a.m., she arrives, a woman in a power suit with a clipboard like a weapon. The tow truck waits behind her in the fog, engine idling, steel chains glinting in the dawn light. Her smile isn't about justice, it's about conquest. And what she takes isn't just a jet ski, it's proof that modern tyranny doesn't wear a crown. It wears a neighborhood badge and calls itself order. But here's what they won't tell you. HOA, boards across the country, were never about keeping lawns trimmed. No, they were modeled after military-style psychological control cells, systems meant to train civilians in obedience. A slow, subtle conditioning. First, you learn to accept surveillance, then control, then punishment, and finally, silence. The woman you'll come to know as Karen Piton was never just a nosy neighbor. She was a manifestation, an agent of a deeper doctrine, local rule enforced by social fear. You've seen her, maybe in your own town, maybe in your mirror. She didn't just overstep. She executed a move straight out of the old institutional playbooks. Fabricate authority, punish resistance, document domination. It's the same psychological loop used by ancient priesthoods and Cold War shadow governments. We are the standard. Dissent is disorder. Ryan Sullivan didn't just lose his watercraft that morning. He crossed a threshold, from civilian to target, from entrepreneur to enemy of the invisible order. What began as a petty grievance would soon explode into the unraveling of a system, a reckoning. But here's the part no one sees. Karen thought she was untouchable because she believed the structure would protect her. She believed power flowed from the title, not from truth. That's the first lie, and the last one you ever believe once you wake up. Because this story isn't about a jet ski. It's about the thin, cracking facade of control, and what happens when a man stands at the edge of that system and decides not to kneel. Stay with me, we're just getting started. There's something ancient in the way institutions operate. HOA, church, corporate boardroom, they all follow the same primal blueprint. Control the symbols, control the people. And in Harbor Point Estates, Karen Piton didn't just enforce rules, she wielded them like sacred texts. When she marched down the dock that morning, barking about regulations and community standards, she wasn't just quoting policy, she was casting a spell. You see, institutional power isn't enforced by force, it's enforced by belief. And Karen had trained her entire neighborhood to believe she was the high priestess of that little empire. But the truth? She was bluffing. Because Sunset Cove Marina, that little stretch of independent waterline, was never under her jurisdiction. It was exempt, legally, historically, and spiritually. It represented freedom, and that terrified her. Because tyrants, even the suburban kind, can't stand what they can't control. So when Ryan, a man who had inherited not just land but legacy, refused to submit, she escalated. Notes, threats. Then, finally, action. She forged authority with a trembling hand and handed it to the tow truck driver like it was gospel, and he obeyed. Why? Because even now, in the age of digital awakenings, most men still flinch when faced with paper that looks official. This is by design. From birth, we're trained to fear letterhead, badges, forms. We confuse formatting with righteousness. Bureaucracy becomes theology. And once that fear is installed, deep in the gut, most never question again. But Ryan did. He reviewed the deed, the zoning, the security footage. He didn't just react to Dowell, he investigated. He gathered truth like a sword, preparing for war, not just with Karen, but with the belief system that backed her. This wasn't about property, it was about programming. Because if Karen could fabricate jurisdiction once, many others have done it 1,000 times over. Quietly, unchallenged, in your neighborhood, at your job, in the courtroom. And that's why this story matters. Not because a jet ski was stolen, but because a man finally said, "Prove your power or shut up." If you're still watching, you're not here for entertainment. You're here because something in you recognizes the pattern. You've seen the same mask, the same tactic, the same slow theft of sovereignty. Comment, "No more false kings," below. Twice, if you feel it. Not just to awaken the algorithm, but to awaken your identity. You're starting to remember, the moment you confront illegitimate power, you trigger a chain reaction. Karen didn't panic because of the jet ski. She panicked because someone saw through her. That's the real threat. Exposure, the loss of illusion. And for the first time in years, someone stood at the edge of her kingdom and said, "This isn't yours." Understand this. Systems like the HOA aren't designed to serve. They're designed to substitute. They offer the illusion of safety in exchange for submission, a gated dream at the cost of your agency. What starts as lawn inspections becomes full-scale psychological conditioning. Over time, you're not just managing your property, you're managing your behavior, your noise levels, your guests, your very presence. And Karen, she was the high-functioning weapon of that system, a bureaucratic zealot with lipstick and a vendetta. But the deeper truth is, she needed to believe she was right. Because if she wasn't, everything else in her world, her control, her identity, her authority, would collapse. That's why she doubled down. It's the same pattern you have seen in history's darkest regimes. When false rulers are challenged, they don't concede. They amplify. They forge documents, weaponize procedure, manufacture consent, because their power never came from truth. It came from agreement, and agreement can be broken. So Ryan did what most men never do. He fought back with law, with footage, with fact. He turned the same mechanisms she misused into weapons of clarity. It wasn't enough to be angry. He became precise, and precision is deadly to manipulators. By Monday, the emergency HOA meeting wasn't just damage control. It was a reckoning, a full-blown tribunal. Karen showed up in black, dressed like a funeral for her own power. And behind her eyes, she knew it. The mask was cracking. What happens when you strip away the paper, the titles, the EMP, tie threats? You find the same thing hiding underneath every tyrant. Fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of losing grip. Fear of a man who knows he's right and can prove it. That meeting was more than an exposure. It was a mirror held up to every resident, every board member, every man watching from behind his own locked front door. And what they saw wasn't just Karen's fall. It was their own silence. The fall didn't begin when Karen was voted out. No, that was just the burial. The real fall began the moment her voice cracked under pressure, when her papers, her posture, her carefully manicured confidence began to unravel under one question. Do you have proof of your authority? And that's where all false empires crumble, not with fire, not with fists, but with questions. Questions that cut deeper than swords. Because if the foundation was fake to begin with, a single truth can bring it all down. Ryan stood there not as a victim, but as a mirror held up to a broken system. And what he showed them, what he forced them to see, was everything they'd ignored for years. The forged mandates, the weaponized HOA rules, the silent compliance of neighbors too afraid to speak up. You want to know the real power move? He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He exposed. In front of the entire neighborhood, Karen's empire of fear collapsed. Residents turned on her, not because they suddenly grew spines, but because fear changes direction once the illusion breaks. She was no longer their shield. She was a liability, a threat to the very comfort she pretended to protect. That's how weak tyrants fall, not with a revolution, but with disgust. Now imagine this. For 8 years, Karen ruled that neighborhood like a queen. People avoided eye contact, adjusted their fences, paid her fines, let her measure their lives with a ruler and a smirk, all because they thought she held the power. But she never did. The power was always in them. And that is the truth most never realize. We're taught from birth to outsource authority, to teachers, cops, bosses, presidents, HOAs. But real power, the kind that bends institutions, comes from clarity, law, and will. 3 things Ryan mastered in one weekend. And Karen, all she had left was the sound of her own heels echoing in a rue, that no longer feared her. Ask yourself this. How many Karens have ruled your life, your workplace, your mind? And when will you stand up, not with rage but with truth so sharp it makes paper tyrants bleed? We're not done yet. We've cracked the surface. Now it's time to dig up the roots. By now you understand, this wasn't about a jet ski. It was about sovereignty. And once a man reclaims it, there's no putting him back in the cage. Karen thought she could walk away unscathed, that the system would close ranks and shield her, as it always had. But she underestimated the power of exposure, of proof, of one man willing to drag the entire rotten structure into the light. And the light, it burns liars. What came next wasn't revenge. It was correction. Legal, public, irreversible. Her name, attached to court documents, to fines, to a viral video watched by thousands. Her face, once the smug symbol of control, now a cautionary tale shared in whispers between neighbors too scared to speak, until now. But here's the deeper truth. What Karen experienced is what every false ruler fears, consequences without escape. Because her authority wasn't just stripped, it was measured, itemized, monetized, $8,000 in illegal fees, $5,000 in punitive damages, $10,000 for fraud, a job lost, a reputation incinerated, a house sold in shame. And still, she didn't understand. Because people like her never see the system. They are the system. They believe that rules are tools to be aimed outward, never inward. But Ryan flipped the lens. He didn't just make her pay, he made the machine swallow itself. This is where you realize, the HOA was never the enemy. It was the template, the training ground, the low-level simulation of something far older. From empires to corporations to digital platforms, they all run on the same software, compliance through confusion, order through fear, and domination through policy. But once you learn to decode it, once you see behind the curtain, you can never unsee it. That's what this story unlocks. It's not about property law, it's about mind control, about the rituals of obedience you've lived under your whole life. How many for? Mrs. Have you signed without reading? How many times have you obeyed, not out of agreement, but out of fear? Now flip it. What happens when you stop? When you demand clarity, when you act, not in rebellion, but in righteous defiance? Karen learned what every tyrant eventually does. You can fake power for a long time, until the real thing walks into the room. And now, that real power might just be waking up in you. And now we arrive at the reckoning. Not hers, yours. Because if you've made it this far, this story was never just about Karen. It was a test, a mirror, a summons. You've been shown every layer. The illusion of local power, the machinery of silent control, the institutional lie wearing a smile and a badge. But the final question is the one only you can answer. What will you do when they come for your line in the sand? Because they will. Not always with tow trucks or forged authority. Sometimes with policies, sometimes with shame, sometimes with distraction. But it's coming. That moment where silence becomes surrender or war. Karen lost everything. Not because Ryan was loud, but because he was clear. And clarity cuts. He didn't ask permission. He didn't beg understanding. He stood on law, on truth, on ownership of his property, his legacy, and his name. That's what broke her. And that's your blueprint. Understand this. Every oppressive system depends on your doubt. They don't need your loyalty, just your hesitation, just enough uncertainty to keep you second-guessing, to keep you inside the gate, head down, following rules written by ghosts. But clarity is nuclear. It annihilates lies in every form. Karen had no jurisdiction, no power, no defense, because one man refused to bend, and once the lie was exposed, everyone else stood up too. That's the hidden law of power. One man's clarity awakens 1,000 others. So here's your final charge. Never bow to paper kings. Never yield to false crowns. And never, ever forget. The system only works when you believe it does. But now, you don't. You've seen it for what it is. The mask, the manipulation, the myth. You've walked the path from theft to truth to judgment. Not for a jet ski, but for your own awakening. Comment, no more false kings below. One last time, if you felt this hit your goal. Not for the views, not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you stopped being a subject and remembered you were sovereign. The next time they knock with rules and threats, ask them the only question that matters. Show me your power, or get off my dock. You're not here to obey. You're here to own. Welcome back. The war for your mind is over, and you won.